So I'm going to cover this because I think this is kind of important. And I think this shows a lot of hypocrisy over, shall we say, some other channels that I don't think are even going to touch this with a barge pole, even though they have pretty much made, since the October 7th attacks, that a daily basis of their channel. And I think if there's a channel out there that has done that and they haven't talked about this, maybe you should ask questions why those particular individuals are not covering this. Because I've always said, right since the very beginning, the big problems in making peace in the Middle East are two key fundamental issues. First and foremost, you have right-wing Israeli government. I think you can even see from what's been going on again recently, they are quite a problem. However, Benjamin Netanyahu wants to extend this war as much as he can because, well, there's a lot of corruption trials following him. So he's trying to stay in power for as long as he can. And he has used this to do so. The next thing you have is Hamas. Hamas is a huge problem. They don't want peace just as much as the right-wing Israeli government does not want peace. Because its very, very aim, always has been, always will be, to see Israel wiped off the map. That's its aim. That's its goal. And if it ever had, like, put in front of it the red button to do so, they'd press it in a heartbeat. But currently in Gaza, there have been protests erupting that show you the displeasure of the Palestinian people. And these protests have been anti-Hamas protests. And the people that have taken part in this are incredibly brave to do so. Incredibly brave to do so, because Hamas does not tolerate dissent. Does not tolerate dissent whatsoever. And they have a history of doing this. So we're going to cover this by a reporter, someone who lived in Gaza, who himself tried to get Hamas removed back in 2019, but had to, flee Gaza for his own safety. So I think what he has to say about this, I think, is very relevant. I think he is right about all these pro-Palestinian allies. Where were they? Where were they when they were covering, when these protests were happening? Why weren't they talking about this? Why weren't they covering this? I think it's very important to cover. So before we go into this, as always, like I say, thank you very much. You know the deal. Links down below, etc., etc. Like, share, all that jazz. So let's go on into this. So this title is Anti-Hamas Protesters Erupt in Gaza. Where are our pro-Palestinian allies now? So the anti-Hamas protesters that erupted last week in the Gaza Strip are a testament to what many of us from Gaza have been saying for years. The people of this beleaguered enclave are exhausted by Hamas's rule and are ready to break free from the terrorist group. Since October of 2023, pundits, news outlets, social media accounts have been asking why Gazans have not protested Hamas during the ongoing war. That answer is painfully simple. How can people protest if they are being bombed, starved, and displaced, when every act of defiance is met with brutal retaliation? Every Gazan family has suffered an unbearable loss. Many have lost sons, daughters, entire lineages. They have been bombed, displaced, and left to fend for survival with very little to no resources. Despite this devastation, thousands took to the street in protest. What critics fail to understand is the brutal life under Hamas's iron grip, where dissent is met with imprisonment, torture, or even execution. They also fail to see why Gazans are as they truly are, not as perpetrators, but as both victims of Hamas's oppression and a war that has now ravaged us and our lands for the past 18 months. Some observers are also asking, why now? Where are the women? Imagine being a woman in Gaza, trying to make your voice heard in a Hamas controlled, male dominated society while simultaneously trying to struggle to secure food and shelter for your family. Even then, the young men, the elderly, all those brave souls who have now risked their life to defy Hamas, even in the streets, are carrying a message far greater than themselves. They are a voice of countless others who very much share their sentiment, but fear the repercussions and consequences of speaking out. For 3 consecutive days, thousands of Gazans risked their lives to raise their voice against Hamas, yet their efforts have been overlooked by the so-called pro-Palestine movement in the West and by most of the news media as well. And I would say that as well. I think people who have made countless videos on this day after day after day, Hassan has ignored this as well. Most of these pro-Palestinian people ignored this. Why? I think that's a valid question. I think they should all have to answer that question. Why have you ignored this protest? Why do you not care about that? I think that's a valid question. I think that very, very much is. So we continue with this. As someone who once tried to protest Hamas and ended up in their jail and torture cells, I understand what this neglect feels like. I know the very deep sense of betrayal that has touched every protester. The painful realization that we have been abandoned, left alone with no one willing to hear them. It's as if the world has resigned them to a fate of living under Hamas's rule. And if that suffering is too inconvenient when it does not fit into the Western narrative of Palestine, which is why they have forsaken the actual people of Gaza like me. Last week's protests were a watershed moment for Gazans, when so many in Gaza finally understood the true meaning of fake solidarity, that the Western pro-Palestine movement, that Palestinians are not seen as real people with real struggles, but as tools to be used in their ideological battles. I think he gets that right to the point. Right to the point indeed. Not only, of course, were those protests ignored by, of course, allies in the West, but they were, but also were the lives of the protesters that they all represent. Hamas, of course, wasted no time in going after the leaders of these protests, threatening, torturing, and even killing them. The family of Odeya Nasir and Al Rabi says that the protester was tortured now to death by Hamas, simply for demanding a free Gaza, free from Hamas and free from war. Where, of course, was the outrage from the pro-Palestine movement? The activists. Were there any protests in any Western capitals for O'Day? They were nowhere. Because he did not, of course, fit into that ideological framework, because his killing was not useful and too inconvenient for their narrative. Meanwhile, when a protester of a distinctly different profile, Mardu Khalif from a former Columbian university and a graduate student, found himself detained in the US. The pro-Palestinian activists who claimed to be advocate for the oppressed wasted no time in flooding Western streets and protests calling for his release. His arrest became an emblem of resistance, sparking global campaigns to bring him home. But what about the young Palestinian from Gaza, who, without the protection of international institutions, was tortured to death for his dissent? O'Day was left to rot in obscurity. His brutal murder by Hamas, nothing more than an inconvenient fact for that very same movement that fervently defended Mahmoud. This is a very stark contrast. It is not only a failure of solidarity, it is also an implicit now of the hollow, opportunistic nature of the so-called pro-Palestine movement. And I would say, I've talked about this before on Geoscope, I think there's a lot of people that have become pro-Palestine. Their support for this is hollow. They really don't care. I really do think they just don't care. I think they just use it for as an opportunity. I think there's a lot of people that have magpied over to this issue. And I think when this is all over and said and done, they'll forget about all this. I think that's sad. I think that is very sad. And I really do feel for this guy and for people who were hoping for some actual solidarity from people from the West, and they got nothing in return. I really do feel for those people. So the stark contrast is not only a failure of solidarity, it is also an implicitness of the hollow opportunistic nature of the so-called Palestine movement. Mohammed, a student in the West, who was elevated to the status of a martyr or die, a young man from Gaza, was left to die at the hands of a very regime that the Western allies refused now to confront. The hypocrisy is staggering. If the pro-Palestinian movement is now unwilling to stand with the Palestinians in Gaza, who are we risking everything to break free now from the shackles of Hamas? What kind of movement is this? If the pro-Palestinian movement cannot recognize the bravery, the sacrifices, and the legitimate demands of those fighting to end the reign of terror in Gaza and the end of this war to try and rebuild their city free of Iranian influence, then it exposes itself as nothing more than a vehicle for political expediency. It is a movement that has used Palestinian lives whenever convenient and then discards them where they are inconvenient. This is the solidarity of these allies offer. It is an insult to the struggles for justice, an empty gesture that does nothing to advance the true cause for true liberation. There's been a lot of people speaking out about that. A lot of people, when this war started out, they were silenced. Like, where have you been all this time? This has been ongoing on for quite some time. Where have you been? They were silenced very, very quickly. And that is sad. I think when you have someone like that speaking up, and you have that going on, and yet a lot of these people who have done a lot of videos about this conflict suddenly have nothing to say about this. I think that's very telling. Very telling indeed. So, as always, let me know what you think down below. And of course, as always, we'll see you all next time. And maybe this should be put a question to San. Why does he not care about those? Why does he not care about that guy that was killed for protesting by Hamas? I think that's the most valid question I think anyone can put forward. So, as always, we'll see you all next time.